Okay, thanks everyone for joining the session. My name is Jon Mitchell. I'm the Global Head of Business, Global Head of Sales Performance at Indicita. I'm going to chair the session with the guys here. So the session is entitled The Bright Sparks Guide to Making Good Profit from EVs. These are the bright sparks. These guys are the ones with the answers. So just introduce them first of all. We've got Kevin Cartwright, General Manager of Ford of Winsford. We've got Nathan Tomlinson, Managing Director of Devonshire Motors, and we have Sam Luscombe, Sales Director for Luscombe. So welcome, gents, and thanks for being part of the session.
Welcome.
So let's start with the all-important discussion about pricing. So we've seen at Indicita over the last 3 months, we've actually seen an uptick in values of 1.3% in terms of used retail values in EVs. And I think from that perspective, we're starting to see price parity with ICE vehicles. What do you do differently in terms of pricing EVs when it comes to retailing? So, Sam, let's start with you.
Not a massive amount, to be honest. Ultimately, price is a function of supply and demand, and you don't treat it any differently to any other item of commerce. You've got to find the balance between supply level and demand level, and that sets the price. Obviously, that dynamic is changing all the time with what's going on with the ZEV mandate. It's a bit of a strange market because it's being manipulated, might be the wrong word, but it's not a true market. It's not a reflection of true supply and demand. I think everything's on fast forward because of the ZEV mandate, which is causing instability. Obviously, if you rewind a few months, we had massive drops in EV values, probably overly dropped. We're now seeing it stabilise because fundamentally they now look pretty good value. So in terms of how we decide we price it, well, the market dictates the price. Okay. We just have to make sure we're buying right.
Yep. Okay. Good. Nathan?
I would agree with Sam on that. At the end of the day, whether it's an EV or an ICE, it's a commodity, and you buy it with a margin in mind. You're aware of your costs, you're aware of the market. We don't treat them any differently. With that said, if it depends on the source. So if you're buying a used EV versus registering a new car and depreciating it, it's a slightly different argument. You've got to be aware of that sharper depreciation curve. But fundamentally, we don't treat them any differently either.
And Kevin, obviously operating in a supermarket space, is it different for you guys?
I don't think it's fundamentally different, but I think obviously we operate at a scale, so we will have circa 2,000 cars in stock, and therefore the risk to us is significantly bigger. And what we would always like to do is probably price the EVs marginally behind the ICE cars at the moment, because there's more certainty in terms of depreciation cycle.
Yep.
You know, the horror story of sort of November, December last year, where there was massive drop off, can just take massive amounts off your profit margin in one fell swoop, and it did. You know, so the beauty of FOW is we have a massive amount of data coming in real time, because of the amount of cars that we sell off our two trading sites. And so, really speaking, we have weekly meetings about them, and we do differentiate the cars slightly in terms of we would want to get the ICE cars through slightly slower than the EVs. The EVs take priority, and a slightly smaller trading margin because we're there, because our paranoia is sort of obsolescence. If somebody produces a car in here today that can do X number of 100 miles, some of the other product then starts to become a real problem child very, very quickly. So just our general policy is through the product as quickly as possible.
I think Kevin's right on that, because ultimately, yes, we don't price it any differently, but our repricing decisions and our speed of sale is critical on an EV.
Okay. Primarily
because its supply is good of used EVs. Competition is a little bit lower because there's a lot of independents who steer away from them. A lot of people have been burned by 5-figure losses on demonstrators, certainly in the franchise space.
Yep.
And because there is another car out there, you can afford to be a little bit, you can discount, you can make sure that you're going to turn it quickly, and then you can go out and replace it again with something else. And that same dynamic isn't necessarily the same with ICE. Sourcing is fundamentally much more difficult with ICE vehicles.
Yeah.
I think you've got to remember that with EV, you're always going to, it's a new product, so you're always going to have that volatility in price. But there's a flip side to that too, and in 3 years, in a 3-year period, I can remember selling used EV for nearly the same price as a new one. It can work both ways. It's not always bad news, and I think that goes back to the point you made originally. you price accordingly.
Okay.
So fundamentally, it's no different.
Yeah, there was a time in 2022 where used EV prices were going through the roof. And actually, yes, there has been a correction, and the headlines are that they've taken massive drops. But if you trace the prices through the last 3 or 4 years, they've had peaks and troughs, and they have gone up, potentially overinflated, and then when they come back down, now look underpriced a little bit.
Yeah, it's going to be an evolution of the technology, isn't it? And customers getting used to it as well. I think it's going to be, it has to be a
And the
game changer.
news feed as well. I mean, the supply and demand thing is driven by sound bites and not necessarily facts. So, the way the news goes, the way consumers respond, it's all tied in. More so with EV, more volatile. With ICE, it's consistent. Petrol prices fluctuate to some degree, but not with the same newsworthiness that electricity seems to generate.
And that's the thing, it is newsworthy. Obviously the Ukraine situation, everyone's electricity bills rocketed, and that story that we had to say, look, change into an EV, you can suddenly save 30, 40, 50 pound a month on your fuel bill. That went overnight. Electricity became actually quite expensive, and then when you add in the friction of charging out on the motorway network, which was actually quite difficult when you had to have an app for this, an app for that. Obviously that situation has now been streamlined and it's getting much better, but it takes time for that to come through into the mind of the consumer.
You had a couple of other points, which is within sort of 6 months you've had a 5-year movement in terms of when ICE would finish. So 2030 to 2035 back to 20, it's like the okey cokey. So from that perspective it's problematic. But in terms of we definitely have got more confidence in the product, because we now turn away sort of finance offers at a lower rate to try and move the product through. We believe that all the product now should be treated identically in terms of offerings to the consumer.
Okay, good stuff. Moving on, let's look at it from a customer experience point of view. What does the sales process look like? Obviously, because a lot of customers aren't familiar with the product, and does it differ for your salespeople to selling an ICE vehicle? Nathan?
100%. So the thing that's really interesting, and in our experience from used EV, is it's a new car customer in disguise. So you talked about price parity initially, and so we can see a used car that's 3 months old, no miles, and as Sam kind of touched on, maybe a 5-figure savings sometimes. That brings a new car buyer into the used car market, but the experience and expectation is still a new car type experience. So yeah, absolutely, you need to spend more time, you need to present the product more carefully, you need to think about your infrastructure, making sure the vehicle's correctly presented, full charge. You'd never put a full tank of fuel in a used car, I'm sure you don't, Kevin. I certainly don't. But you do need to fully charge an EV battery, because it's a different expectation, it's a different scenario, and you don't want to start off on the wrong foot. I'd say the same for 12-volt battery failure. There's always going to be a car on the forecourt with a flat battery, and you try to mitigate that. But you really don't want an EV on the forecourt with a flat battery, because it's a terrible introduction. So it's the details. There's nothing wrong with them being outside on the forecourt. They don't need to be in the showroom, but you've got to pay attention to the details. And that's at the physical stage. Prior to that, website, what does a used EV look like on your website? Do you provide comparison tools? Because people will know that their existing vehicle, 350 miles on a tank full, 60 quid to fill it up. How do you make that comparison stand out for an EV on your website? I drive EV. I have an overnight tariff that's 6p a kilowatt. It costs me £4.50 to do 320 miles. But you can't always see that transparently, digitally, while customers are doing their own research.
Fundamentally, from my point of view, retailing EVs is harder than retailing ICE cars. You've got to work harder. That's because the customer comes in, and you obviously do your qualification on any customer who walks into the showroom, but with an EV you've got to understand their level of knowledge of EV, because you get lots of people coming to the showroom who are well versed, understand it, sometimes know more than the salespeople know, because they've gone away and they've done all this research. Because when you buy an EV, you're not just changing your car to have maybe a slightly bigger engine and new features. You're changing how you fuel your car, you're changing where you pay for that fuel, whether it's at the pump or on your home tariff. So there's all sorts of different things you've got to factor in, and lots of people come in having done that research. So therefore, when you're speaking to those people, you need to be on a level with them, because one thing that will destroy any trust that a customer has with you is when they know more than you, or you tell them something and they know that's actually fundamentally wrong. Trust is gone. You then got the other side of the spectrum who come in and sort of, well, I've heard that I probably should buy an EV, I'm half tempted, well, I don't know anything about them, can you educate me? And from that perspective, you've got to start again. Because you imagine somebody coming into a showroom and ICE was the new technology. You'd have to explain to them that, oh yeah, oil goes in there and it's got a clutch and this is the main...
Yeah.
I've got no idea. Well, you're educating on all this sort of stuff. Well, the same applies to an EV. This is not technology that people are familiar with. It's all brand new to everybody. So you've got to guide them through that process and really fundamentally explain, this is where it benefits you, this is where you may have a potential drawback. If you're comfortable with that, here are the benefits, and it's going to save you X amount of money, or it's going to make your life better in this way, shape or form. If you can't live with that and you want to drive up and down, you're a travelling salesman doing 500 miles a day, okay, if you can get used to the idea that you're going to stop and charge for 15 minutes, then you need to factor in the charging speeds. It's a much more handheld process in buying an EV than it would be an ICE.
Yeah, from our perspective, obviously we're the jack of all trades. These lads are focusing on specific manufacturers and specific product. We have to know as much as we can about as many of the cars that we deal with as they can. The actual quoting process from our perspective is nigh on identical. But what we do find with the EV customers is they buy very, very quickly, or they don't buy very quickly, and we need to treat them differently. And the flash to bang for the EV customers for us is about 48 hours longer from going to quote to order unless they buy on the same day, because we do have a same day drive-away service on about 20% of the stock. For those customers, what we've done a massive amount of work on is trying to give them almost like, not subliminal messaging, but additional messaging. So we would have a meet the manufacturers board. So the new Chinese manufacturers coming to market, they have an understanding of who they are, who they're owned by, what provenance there is, what level of guarantees there is, what support's available, just as one example. And with the other thing that we've taken a lot from in the last sort of 12 months is there is a massive amount of support from people like your finance providers, but also your warranty providers, because we're able to give them sort of pretty good information now in terms of sort of the maximum size of claims that we're seeing and what that's applicable to, and get rid of some of the bogeymen, which is the stuff that you alluded to previously, which is that it's just really problematic. So quoting process nigh and identical, follow-on journey for a non-buyer pretty significantly different. Where again we're looking at it was almost like bringing a fish to bank. You can't just sort of whack it up and just drag it in, which you can do with the ICE customers. You've got to help them, and our follow-up to those type of customers are not sales orientated, they're much more customer service orientated. How will you charge? What charging availability do you have on your premises? Do you understand the charging timelines? Do you know the difference between 3, 7, 11, 23 kilowatt charging and the impact of how that's going to have on you? And by giving them that information, that's how you're turning it from sort of that generalised inquiry into sale for that particular type of customer.
You've also, sorry, just to add to that, you've also got the digital journey, which is far more important. One of the things that struck me 4 or 5 years ago when we started selling EV was that generally dealer websites were crap, because you'd have a box there that said engine size, blank. Yeah. You'd have like miles per gallon, blank. Well, if somebody comes on and their first experience of an EV is that, oh, these guys don't even know that it hasn't got an engine, you're like, where am I starting? So we've done a lot of work to bring that information to the fore, mainly because we saw the third-party publications cropping up, like Fully Charged YouTube channels got millions of views, electrifying.com, all to serve to educate the users, because nobody in the industry, nobody in the dealer network or the manufacturer world was doing it particularly well. So we went down a stream of, well, if we can educate, we build trust with customers, they're far more likely to buy from us.
Yeah. Totally agree. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So the next question we've got is, in terms of selling new versus used EVs, from an environment perspective, where you're selling them, how does that differ? Because obviously a new EV is in a nice shiny showroom, but the used EV is probably sitting out on the lot in the rain potentially as we're going into winter. How does that differ?
Not massively for us.
Okay.
We operate 2 franchises where the showroom experience is important, but it's not a gin palace. Somebody comes in and I think they value far more the expertise and the information that our execs and our website give, more so than the physical environment. I think the difference between new and used EVs is clearly, when you talk about ICE, you've got the condition factors that affect the value of a used ICE vehicle, which primarily are bodywork and all that sort of the same, but it's service history, which is less important on an EV, but what is really important is battery health. So it's really important that the customer knows. It's almost that they don't even know that they need to know that. So we have to make them know that they need to know that. Because you wouldn't buy, or you'd certainly think twice about buying a 5-year-old car with no service history, because it suggests the oil's never been changed. If you buy a 5-year-old EV and you've got no idea what the state of health on the battery is, you could be buying a car that's advertised at 200 mile range, but really its maximum capacity now is 140. And that therefore has a different value. In terms of the difference between new and used then, it's fundamentally, as Nathan said, the customer, they don't come in saying I specifically want a new or a used. They want one that's going to fit their lifestyle and fit their budget, and they want to know that they're not going to be legged up with a car that's going to be obsolete in 2 or 3 years. This whole myth around it's not a myth, but obviously everyone's iPhone dies after a couple of years. The battery becomes knackered, and like you get half what you used to get. And everyone thought that would carry through onto EVs, and that in 3 years your car would only be able to do half what it said. Which is hopefully over time being dispelled, that myth. And actually you can do several 100,000 miles and still have more than 80%, as long as the battery's been looked after. Again, people don't know how to look after the battery. What does looking after a battery mean? And again, it's all about that education piece.
I think we'll come back to that if we've got a bit of time about in terms of battery health and how the industry is going to deal with that. And Nathan, from your perspective, is there any difference?
So our demonstrators are parked outside. So fundamentally, test driving a new car versus test driving a used car, no difference. Okay. The difference is the way that we prepare those vehicles. So the demonstrator is always clean. It's always parked in a way that can be easily driven away. It's always fully charged. It's a perfect example of a car. We need to make sure I made the same point earlier, but we need to make sure we apply those same standards to the used EV, and then fundamentally it's no different. And of course it's slightly different being from a franchise perspective, because you've got the new car in the showroom that's very, very similar. When we're talking about used EVs, we're typically talking 6 to 24 months old. Yep. So it's not fundamentally too different. You can show a customer around a new car and you can send them out in a used car. There's a lot of parity. It'd be interesting to hear Kevin's point of view, because so you don't have that same showroom scenario with the new car.
I mean, for us, obviously, our EV product probably makes up 10% of the 2,000 cars there or thereabouts in stock, so it's a significant number of vehicles. I think there's a couple of points which have obviously previously been made, which is we try to... Initially, we've come away from list price comparison, because the list prices versus what they're really being sold for is just significantly different. So you lose your credibility if you try to go down a route you might have done previously. So we tried to do any cost comparison versus really what the product is going for on the open market. And post-COVID, pre-COVID, FOW would have been a 0 to 3-year-old business, because there was loads and loads of availability. Post-COVID, we've had to go a lot deeper into the market, and what we're trying to do is reclaim ground back towards a newer product, because they then qualify for the warranties and the finance packages and the PCPs that are coming onto the market for the EV product. So from that perspective, that's certainly one big aspect that we're concentrating on. The secondary parties, EV or ICE with us, will displayed identically, apart from the fact if it's a genuine EV vehicle, we will put the little green flash onto as a self-identifier if it wasn't on by age previously. The darling of our market currently is the hybrid, because obviously we're seeing people who just are 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and that's the quickest moving stock that we've got. Yep. So from that perspective, that's a real winner for us at the present time, because it's if you can drive 100 miles to work and back on your electric charge and get yourself used to it, but you've got your safety net. We've seen also that's also a way to sort of maximise good profit on the HEV as well as BEV.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. So just going back to Sam's point, we talked about battery health. Where is the industry from your perspective in terms of supporting dealers with apps to show customers battery health? And are customers starting to ask, like they are when they buy a second-hand iPhone now, I want to know the maximum charging capability before I purchase it? Are customers at that stage now that they're asking about battery health?
Yes and no.
Okay.
again, it's that disparity between knowledge that I mentioned earlier on. Some people are well versed, understand the difference, and will only buy a car if they know it. The other thing is that actually nobody really knows what a good battery health is.
Right. Yeah.
We do battery health testing on some of our cars. And I've got like 3-year-old cars that are like low 90s, and I'm like, oh. And then I've got 1-year-old cars that are 99. So I can't work out, and there's no sort of industry standard yet to work out whether that's different types of testing. I won't go into the details of how it all works, but I understand that there's some tests that can go into the OBD port and read the BMS, and then there's some that you have to fully drain it and fully recharge it so it can physically measure the capacity of the battery. So I'm sat up here as a bright spark on EVs. I still don't know really if there's an industry standard for battery testing. From what I've heard, there's plans for new cars later in the decade to have this as standard, so that there's a new regulation coming out that the car will have to tell you its battery state of health. Yeah. But again, from the used car market, that could be 10 years away. So we've had the same sort of discussion, like, do I advertise that this car's got 90% state of health at 3 years old and 30,000 miles? Is that transparency a selling point, or is that actually a reason for somebody to go, oh, well, I thought it'd be more than that. I've seen another brand that's 98%. Yeah. It's a challenge that we haven't yet overcome. There's some guys in the room somewhere back there who are sort of selling battery health testing via the OBD as a service to the industry, which is obviously going to have to become a major part of retailing used EVs. It's whether the consumer understands what metric is good and whether
what does good look like.
What does good look like? Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Nathan, anything from you?
Slightly different perspective from me. We've been around EV since 2009, and in those early days, people used to ask us things like, what happens if it rains? And can you take it in a car wash? And I kind of feel like this battery health thing is transitional, and it's a question, and when it appears in the news, more people ask us. But by the same token, we've got a 5-year-old 30,000 mile EV in regular daily use on our fleet. When new, it had a claimed mileage of 278, and it regularly does 320 on a full charge 5 years later. And so a lot of the time, to take Sam's point on the question itself, it's how you handle that question. So in an uneducated format, if somebody asks you whether or not you can provide a battery health certificate, you might find yourself saying yes or no, or you might find yourself saying, I've been driving one for 5 years and its battery is actually better today than they claimed it was when it was new. I just feel like it's one of those things that may well disappear over time. As we jump into new technology, we're all finding our feet with it, but equally, it may well be the metric that matters the most going forward. It's a shakeout period, and I think,
I think the interesting point there will be what do the remarketers do? I noticed that BCA now have battery state of health on their condition reports. I think that's going to be led primarily from maybe even from the leasing sector to say, right, well, have you used and abused this battery? The customers know they can use and abuse a battery. If you do nothing but rapid charge it all the time and you leave it left at 100% for long periods, the state of health on that battery is going to be worse than one that's gently charged on a slow charger, balance charged. I don't think that's going to come from us as retailers. I think that's going to come from probably the remarketing or even the handback sector of the leasing market to say, hang on a second, what is the resale value of this car, and is it more or less if the battery is...
Yeah, I think you're right. I think if you think about it from a lease company's point of view, if somebody doesn't look after the battery, then there's potentially a recharge there down the line, just like if they didn't look after the bodywork. So
I think there's the only sort of thing that, just sort of add to some of the comments which you absolutely bang on, is for anybody that's coming into the sector that's not currently in it, or anybody that's, the one thing you can't do is play with it. You've got to go in it with both feet. So if FOW has been successful in terms of getting sort of used EV sort of awards, it's because we'll go for the maximum amount of charging points, and just because the car can't take the charge now doesn't mean the next generation won't take it next. So from that perspective, whatever you've got as an investment, put everything into it, go as far as you can. And you're talking sort of, we want to pretty much now put a charging point in that's lower than 11 kilowatts and 11 to 23s, and then you're into your 3 amps for your amps per phase, and so from that perspective is if you come to either of our two trading sites, they will both be heavily source with sort of EV charging points, but they will be right to the top end of the spectrum because the technology will catch up with the initial technology.
But also the brands are getting smarter at realising that this is tomorrow's used car market when it's a new car. So the warranty period, the end of warranty support, all those processes are getting better and stronger. And so many of these problems ultimately will be solved organically as time goes by. And that's no different to any other kind of innovation.
I think
something comes out, it's new, it's all over the place, but over time it settles down. And
given the recent challenges with the finance that we've all sort of sat through and had kittens with sort of like two Tuesdays ago, the thing about it is obviously from a customer confidence point of view, now that the finance companies are offering GFEs or GMFEs for the product, it's a profit centre to the trade, but it's actually a customer service because it takes away that fear for those that can remember it of a Rover or a Saab situation where a car's worth one thing and then becomes worth significantly less overnight. So actually doing something that's cash generative to your business also is a fantastic thing for the customers, especially as the interest rates come off previous or current highs, and you're just bringing people into that cycle out. You make them think of it as a mobile phone. You've had it, you've used it. If somebody else wants to do that, fantastic, but it's time for you to have a new toy, and here's your protection.
Okay, good. So just moving on then, in terms of the brands that we have now in the market, obviously all the brands are at different stages. As used car retailers, do you find it easier to deal with the established brands in terms of selling EVs, people like Tesla, that's the only thing that they build, and in terms of getting the level of knowledge in your sales execs when they're selling these cars, are they finding it comfortable to sell long-standing brands that have been doing EVs for a longer time, and do you shy away from buying stuff that's a bit more niche at the moment?
not particularly. I don't know if you're the same, but we
to be honest, I do, and I think you made a really good point when we talked before about why you buy Tesla, because it's the product itself is really clear in terms of variants, and you can't get it too wrong. I certainly shy away from buying other brand EVs because I know I'll get it wrong. But actually that's no different to when I started buying ICE cars. And I think that's probably a key message to take home. You do have to be part of this shift. There's no choice in it, and you are going to get it wrong to start off with.
The beauty of ours is obviously we can take a calculated gamble, for example, with up to 100 cars of stock because of the scale of the business. So if you look at like the current darlings of the market and sort of the new Chinese manufacturers or Chinese manufacturers that own previous British badge or whatever, we can take an educated gamble. To begin with, probably these two guys probably wouldn't want to, because again we'll get that data feedback really, really quickly, and we'll start to understand whether they will sell. Because years and years ago, again, it's I think the beauty of the car trade is there's always been something that's not massively dissimilar. When Hyundai and Kia came in, everybody's like, what's that? When people made fortunes out of things like Lada and Skoda, when other people were sneering at the product, from that perspective, if you basically treat it almost as one of those type events, our buyers, our owners, the Ford brothers, buy 50% of our stock. And so the thing is, we will go both feet in on a product because it'll either work or it won't.
Yeah, Kevin's absolutely spot on, but you have to know what you're doing. So you talk there about, like, does it differ to ICE? Well, I wouldn't really be comfortable going in and buying a BMW because I don't know BMW's packs and accessories, and it's got to have a sunroof to sell and all that sort of stuff, because it's not my area of expertise. But what
you need to? I mean, you generate enough of your own.
No, correct. But if I want to grow my used car, we currently stock about 120 used cars. I want to grow that. I've got to look at where is the opportunity to grow. I'm competing with, if I want to start selling 3 Series, Audi, whatever, where it's got to have that pack, it's got to have that pack. I don't have that knowledge, and I don't really. It's a saturated space. With EV, we deal primarily in Suzuki and MG value brands, where our average sort of used car is sub 15 grand. I've now started buying Porsche Taycans, Tesla Model Ys, the sort of stuff that I would never ever dream of. And all right, it's a bit ballsy, and I got a bit nervous the first couple of times, but fundamentally, because I understand the EV, the rest of it is sort of secondary. I can have a conversation with a Porsche buyer in the same way I can have a conversation with an MG buyer, because fundamentally what they need to know is that they know about the car, they've sold themselves on a Porsche, they want to know about buying from a retailer who understands EV. And from a buying perspective, Kevin's absolutely right. Like, if you don't know what you're doing, you are going to catch a cold, because it was a leap of faith. It was an educated gamble. But if you, it was Tesla that we first started on, because I looked at the market and went, well, actually, there are no Tesla dealers. So if you want to buy, and some people want to buy from a franchise dealer, maybe even if it's not the franchise of the car that they're looking to buy, there is some sort of appeal to buying from a franchise dealer. Tesla don't have any franchise dealers. So if you want to buy a Tesla, you can either buy it from an independent or you can buy it from Tesla. If you buy it from Tesla, it's very expensive. So I thought, well, actually, if you buy it from us, you're getting a franchise retailer experience. And it turned out to work out pretty well. But it's that case of only do it if you know what you're doing.
How does that work for prep and aftercare? And have you found any pitfalls? I'm sure you have found some pitfalls.
I started off making sure, because Tesla got a 4-year manufacturer warranty, so keep it under manufacturer's warranty, which is what I was doing. The sweet spot there is I was aiming for 2 to 3 year old stuff, because sub 1 year old you're exposed to the manufacturer, especially now in Q4 where there's ZEV mandate pressure. I don't want to be exposed where I've got a late plate Peugeot and Peugeot decide, right, we're whacking £5,000 off this car brand new, and I'm sat on a potential problem. So it's scouring the market. It's used car stock management, but it's on fast forward, because everything is, the risk is greater. But
I think, as you come traditionally, you'd have started buying middle November, like now, to buy contrarian and get all the cars in, get them prepped, get them ready for December the 27th. When you're talking about people now having to do distress sale because they're going to pay somebody some money somewhere if they haven't hit target or quota and they can't offset to a different manufacturer, we will probably go later to market for EV than we will for ICE, and that is a definite differentiator, because if people have to bring the pricing down to distress sale, it will have a knock-on effect in terms of residual.
Okay. Last couple of questions, and then we'll get some questions from the audience before we wrap up. But in terms of customers that come in, how do you go about converting a customer to be looking at an EV that they potentially hadn't come in to look at? They were coming in to look at an ICE vehicle, and maybe especially with you, trying to get them to consider an EV. How do you go about that?
It's part of the qualification process. We would never ram a car down somebody's throat. We operate a very sort of relaxed sales environment. We're not pushing EV specifically. We're not saying, right, we've got X amount of EVs in stock, they need to go. We'll take the inquiry and find the right car for that person. Now, if that means that when we do the qualification, ask them what the use case is, have you considered one? Well, no, I haven't. All right, well, let's try and explain to you why it may be beneficial. And actually, for some people, it's not. I'm not going to shy away.
But it's part of your fact find now every time, is it?
Absolutely, yeah. I would never. What I don't want to do, certainly from our customer experience point of view, is I don't want to force somebody into, or not force, but nudge somebody into a car that actually turns out in 6 months' time was wrong for them. Yeah. One, because I'll have a pissed off customer, and two, because I've got a real problem then with. I like to bill myself as helping people to go EV, and if I'm pushing somebody into it wrongly, it's no good for my brand, really.
It's one of the real big benefits of having a firm sales process, because your compliance acts as your qualification. If somebody's telling you they're doing 24,000 miles per year or more, it is very unlikely they're going down that road. But we have a massive following in the Cheshire area, in the Cheshire villages around our Winsford site, and we've got a lot of chimneys around the Manchester site near the Trafford Centre. Through compliance 1, compliance 2, and your demands and needs, you get a really good profile of your customer, and that's why it's so important that it's done properly all the time, every time, and drummed in as part of that really singular process, because at the end of it you can turn and say, well, here's your two options. There's the sister car of the two. And
that's the questions you've got to be asking. It's not only what is your mileage, but what's your mileage profile. If you're doing 250 miles a day, but it's all around town, actually, that's costing you a fortune in petrol. Yeah. If you're not exposed and don't need to be at a rapid charger very often, the more miles you can do within the range of the vehicle, the bigger the saving you've got. So if you're doing high mileage around a local area, an EV's perfect. Yeah.
In summary, ICE is car sales, EV is helping people learn. Okay. So it's about getting somebody into a car to drive and experience what an EV actually is in the first instance, because as we've touched on, it's a lot of the technology is different. Fundamentally it looks like the same thing, but there's a button to make it go backwards and forwards. You've got to get used to all that kind of stuff. Mostly when people do, they almost immediately become a fan of the experience, and at that point then they go on to learn, and it's helping them learn. My key point would always be, we did some research recently. Petrol and diesel would have to be less than £1 a gallon to compete with electricity in a car for a method of propulsion, right? If you told me as a manufacturer you built a car that could do 350 miles to the gallon, I'd have a queue of people outside for it. Why haven't I got a queue of people outside for an EV? Because they don't yet understand those cost-saving benefits.
Next generation finance calculator should do that for you. You'd have that's your monthly repayment, that's your monthly repayment, that's your offset saving, and just take it to a whole new level.
So it's still an education piece, and we've got some distance to go, but that's great. Thanks, guys. We should have Mike. If you've got any questions from the audience, if you put your hand up, we can get a microphone to you. Anyone got a question about EVs? Gentleman here, I was just going to fetch the microphone. Hold on 1 sec. There we go. There's a gentleman just here on the left. Super.
Hi, yeah. You've touched on it briefly, but how important is the actual look of the site, your sites, and how engaged you are as businesses in solar PV, charging, as you mentioned, decent charging on the sites, to make sure that, especially as the younger generations are coming in, who are bought into this subject, that they can see that you live and breathe it as much as trying to sell it.
Everyone get that?
Yeah, thanks, Darren.
Yeah.
Really important to have solar on the roof. But joking aside, we made this point very early on. There'll come a time when people won't buy a clean car from a dirty business, and actually the same applies to countries to a certain degree. So early stages where we are today, it's probably not a massive factor today, but it's certainly going to be. And then you've got business rates and all sorts of other things tied into carbon footprint. So personally, and we're in a fortunate position to be developing the business at this moment in time, I think it's very important.
I missed bits of the question, but I think it was to do with the site. And from our perspective, it's the physical bits that people can touch and see. So we have dummy charge units to understand. If you mentioned Type 2, you mentioned 3-pin. Do people know what the different charging types are? If they've got an old Nissan Leaf that might have a CHAdeMO connector, all these sort of words that go around your head, and people are like, zone out, I don't understand it all. If you've got physical displays there to show you, right, well, this is what a CHAdeMO type charger looks like, this is a Type 2, and if you go on the motorway, it's a CCS type connector, and that's what this looks like. Suddenly, these words get associated with actual things. It becomes a lot easier to help show customers, and obviously solar helps. We've quite honestly, we've gone down the solar route, but we've gone down the solar route from a cost perspective, not from an EV evangelist perspective. But obviously there will be some customers who find that attractive.
Our main site at Winsford's got a large solar display now on the main display. As you walk in, you walk through our reception building, and then you walk out to the main building itself. And there is, and I think it is very much linked to that, because it's saying that you are going down that road. You know, the key thing I think from ours is just assume nothing. Most of our EV display, we don't differentiate, but we would like to try and put, if you have two identical cars and one's ICE and one's EV, where possible we pair them, and we put the two side by side and say there is no real difference. You're going to have to find the differences. It's almost like when other companies you sell the European imports, you find the difference, because if you don't find the difference, there's a saving to be had. You know, so from that perspective, the combination is there, and have it as close as we possibly can to sort of the main charging points. And again, just point out to say, look, that's how much we've invested and are investing in this infrastructure. So again, we're not here to play at it.
So passing the confidence on to the customer is really key.
But to the question, we're about this far away, aren't we, from being told how many times we can fly a year and how much meat we can eat. So it really is just around the corner before people will judge your business on its carbon footprint. And if you're going to be a leader in EV, then you need to be very aware of what you've got around you, not just the product.
Good. Excellent. Any other questions? Gentleman down here? And one at the front.
5 minutes as well.
Thanks very much. You talked a lot about the way that customers are buying EVs on the site, and a little bit around the marks that you kind of be buying to stock your sites. But can you talk a little bit more about the way that you think about stocking decisions for EVs that you want to list on your sites?
Did everyone get that? About
Sorry,
decisions?
I missed most of that. About stocking, was it?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about what are the factors that inform the cars, the EVs that you want to be listing? Do things like battery health, would you care about that sort of thing when you're buying stock?
Are you checking battery health yourself, Sam, when you're buying?
We're not. I'd like to, but it comes back to that point around how do you do that in a relatively frictionless way. So if I say to somebody, right, I'm going to come and buy your EV as a private customer or via motorway, like, how do I'd love it if motorway could tell me, right, okay, that's the state of health on that battery. There is no way for the customer to be able to do that to their own car. If I go out and then measure the battery health on the car, if it's horrendously low, I might say, well, actually the car's worth a little bit less. That's going to be a very jarring experience for the customer who's got no understanding about that. So what I am thinking about doing now, which I haven't fully fleshed it out yet, is saying when we buy a car, whether it's private, whether it's Cartwright, whether it's motorway, and we say, right, okay, we will buy your car at this price they agreed on the assumption that the state of health is above 90%. And we get there and we plug it in to our OBD report reader. I don't know how it sits with the public, really, because it's not something that it's not been raised yet.
We've had dealings with a company that works in bikes rather than cars, and the difference is they send somebody out and they do all those checks at point of curbside. Now, if people want to look at doing that, you know, that's a really good way to sort of go down that road. You know, the other thing we do is my ops manager could bore you to death for hours on this. You know, but he calls it dynamic scheduling. So the first thing that we'll do when the car comes in is the OBD port stuff is amazing, and if the car tells you it. But going back to that infrastructure side, if you come to an FLW site, we'll have 8 to 10 cars, we'll drain it, because that's the one that gives us the most confidence. And if what that number is once we've done that exercise is the number on basically on the reader, then at that point in time I'm really comfortable with my sales teams going, right, this is relatively bulletproof now, because you're coming from two sources of information. I can't blame a third-party subcontractor if I haven't checked the car for anything else, paintwork or whatever, so I can't really do the same with readers. So the best thing for us is a full battery drain because of scale, and again just have 10 cars on with 10 behind, and then try to get them done as fast as is humanly possible, because then I can sell with confidence.
But it does inform your pricing. That would inform your pricing.
It's that thing, isn't it? You know, every buyer wants to buy as little as possible and go. But the thing is, if we buy a car that's wrong, I think the difference is, rather than try and rescue it like we've probably done with a nice car, it's just send it back to market and take the smallest hit possible, because you can't afford to have. You know, there's less things to go wrong on the ICE cars ultimately, but the one thing that can go wrong is a game changer.
I think in answer to that question is it informing pricing decisions? Not yet, but from us, but I think it will. I think at the moment, if you can display the battery state of health, for example, it's a reassurance, it's a tick box, it gives that consumer some confidence in us as a retailer. I don't think we can necessarily command more for it. We could use it as a negotiation point when somebody wants some discount to say, okay, ours is 90x%. You might have seen one cheaper elsewhere, but if you don't know what the state of health on that battery is, do you really want to take that risk? I don't know. I don't think it's going to be retailers who decide whether state of health is something that consumers are willing to pay for, and I think we're nowhere near there yet. But I think over time, as the technology evolves, and certainly by the time manufacturers put it in the cars, it'll be commonplace. I think.
Okay, one last quick question for the gentleman at the front here. Thank you.
It's really around the secondary cost on a used EV of the charger for customers. So it's how do you overcome that? How do you tie it in or make that easier for the customer? Because you've got that sell of the EV, but then that secondary sell of £1,000 for your charging box.
30 seconds on this one, guys.
I'll be very quick. There are lots of partners out there. Affinity EV are here today. They sort of do a lot of work around educating customers that, yes, you have got the upfront cost of a charger, but if you really think about your home energy needs and how you're going to save money, you can offset that with an overnight tariff. Nathan mentions you pay 6p a kilowatt. If a lot more of your usage of your electricity at home is going to be your car, that suddenly becomes becomes a big saving to have 6p a night to fill up your 50, 60, 70 kilowatt hour battery.
The other thing I'd say for our business is we've got Go Zero as obviously one of our sort of partners, and the one thing is we're talking to ICE customers and saying, would you like a referral to that company to get educated before you decide to jump? You know, and obviously again I've referred a couple of times to the finance options, because you know, whatever you talk about, if you go 2024 and you're on a PCP, it's 2024, 2028, 2032, 2036. you can cater to a whole chunk of people and say, when you're ready, jump in. If you're the equivalent of a Luddite, or you love your petrol and diesel, you can play your game for you can play long term. But by offering EV type technologies to our customers, you're letting them have a play with it.
But you do need to provide the solution. So it needs to be a package, and it's no good just selling the car.
Great. Well, that's come to the end of the session. Thanks everybody for participating, and thanks to the panel for joining us. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.